His boss just had an article on the cover of HBR this month about design thinking. Madison comes from a design background, a family of designers, I believe.
Sure, yes, architects, yeah.
Studied industrial design at CMU, and he's been at a couple of big agencies, Fitch as well as IDEO. And back at the turn of the millennia, Madison and I were paired together at a startup, which was a very trying experience, I think, for Madison, but
No, it was amazing.
A great learning experience for me.
Yeah. Actually, at that startup was where I first worked with IDEO. So we had IDEO as the agency that did our product development. That was the first experience that I had with this firm before joining 13 years ago.
And so Madison's been at IDEO a long time, and worked on a lot of different parts of the business there and a lot of different client projects.
Yep.
So thanks again for joining us. And so we're going to have a brief Q&A with Madison, which I'll start, and then you guys can feel free to ask Madison some questions.
Yeah.
So Madison, design thinking is a big deal now. How would you summarize its essence to the layperson?
I'm happy to do so. I don't believe there's a layperson, but I'm happy to give it a brief overview. So design thinking really is kind of an abstraction of the design process. And that design process sort of classically defined as this notion of observation, pattern finding, idea generation, prototyping, giving feedback on those prototypes, refining based on that feedback, and then repeating until you are out in the market, but then kind of continuing to do that while you're in market. There is kind of no stopping, right? You're always refining, prototyping, learning, and going on and on and on. That abstraction, we didn't quite create it, but we labeled it as such to make it obviously much more extensible to the business context. Because as a designer, you kind of learn this through school and through startups and through trying things. And then what we found out is we was having a hard time relating that to the broader world. And by putting a name on it of design thinking, you kind of label it and make it much more learnable, shareable. You can write articles about it. You can write books about it. You can teach classes about it. It kind of packaged up our process in a way that just made it much more digestible or sellable. And that's why it was labeled or created as such. And one other interesting thing is, and to go into one of our follow-on questions, I think one of the reasons why it's resonated so well is because largely the process of innovation in corporate America in the past has been analytical, right? It's about looking back at the past at what's worked to then kind of create, a model for then what could work in the future. And that's ridiculous. You can't you can learn from the past to do the future, but you can't actually study the past to figure out what's next. Instead, that's a process of creation, a process of prototyping, of creating, analytical approaches can be great as an augment to a design thinking approach, but it can't be your primary way of innovating, in our opinion, my opinion. And please, if anyone has questions or I'm not making any sense, I can see about 7 of you, but raise your hand and let me know, or just ask it. There's no raising hands, I suppose.
Okay, so yeah, that's interesting. The company that telephone poles in Milwaukee for the last 5 decades, maybe they could, predict incrementally demand, and that was important to their business. But now there's probably some company that sells those telephone poles online, and they have to really fundamentally rethink things.
Totally. I mean, there is a version of innovation, that kind of incremental innovation, whether that's pulling price out or just kind of doing very basic stuff, but sort of perfecting what you already have in the world. That can benefit from an analytical approach. When you're really trying to create the new, the stuff that's in the upper right-hand part of the 2x2, well, you can't use a wholly analytical approach to kind of get there.
Can you tell us more about what you think the design process delivers? I mean, because design thinking is so new to the broader business community, at least as a specific body of practice, maybe design investments aren't that well understood, but they clearly deliver a lot.
Right.
How do you help clients understand the potential value of design to their business?
Totally. And then design thinking actually was created to broaden that definition of design, right? So designers were typically relegated, or design process was typically relegated to the kind of downstream portion of innovation, right? It was kind of, design kind of puts form around things, or makes them look good, or makes them more sellable. With well, our approach with design has been you can actually form whole companies. You can design whole companies using a design process and or design thinking, which obviously, again, just makes it much more approachable to a broader audience. Designers have a bad habit of talking to themselves too much. Design thinking was a way to make that broader appeal. The value of it, the benefit of it, is kind of you're just de-risking throughout the process, throughout the product, to an innovation process, right? You're through prototyping early, as opposed to waiting to the very end. You're going to learn more of the reaction to it, how it feels, how it looks, how it works, and you can prototype everything from organizational structures all the way to actual physical products. We also don't believe you should be prototyping at the very end. You do that every day throughout the journey. A prototype early on can be low fidelity and high volume, and a prototype, and the purpose of there is to gain inspiration. Later on downstream, the purpose of a prototype, it's high fidelity, low volume, and that's much more about refining and or validation, oftentimes further down.
And most people probably agree that this stuff's a good idea and it's valuable and it makes companies healthier. And yet, I wouldn't say the practice of these kind of things is widespread. What's hard for companies about shifting to a broader application of design thinking?
Yeah, I think the hardest single thing from an individual client to a broad organization is the design process. The design thinking process inherently values failing, right? We love to fail. Failure is the process of learning, right? A prototype, you put it out there, oops, it broke. Good, it broke. Now you can learn about that. A typical corporate environment, failure is seen as failure, as the enemy, the kind of thing that will get you fired. And to get people past that hurdle of instead, like saying it's okay to fail because that is proving that you're learning something, is probably the biggest challenge that people have with it. Because it's just not, even from day one in school, of a kindergartners actually embrace failure well. I think it's beaten out of us sometime in middle school and or high school where you can no longer fail, and that's ridiculous, right? Failing is, in our opinion, one of the best things you can do. Obviously, you want to fail early so you can succeed sooner. You don't want to fail at the very end. Failing in market is not something that we embrace, but instead you want to fail as early as often as possible, because then you're learning a lot more. So you can you can refine the prototype, refine whatever it is as you move it forward through the process. Sorry, the sun is rising on me. Can you see out that window? It's not a bad place to work, I have to say.
Thanks for coming into work so early. I didn't know if you were going to do this.
Yeah, no, the sun is rising, I should say. It is. I woke up at 5 a.m. just for you all.
Oh, God. Thank
you. The room is much bigger than the 6 of you that I can see, apparently.
Yeah. So, there's this fear of failure and this difficulty in approaching things that are likely to fail. What things have you seen help people work through that? Is it the seeing it work in small batches and the confidence that it's actually?
Yeah. So our process, and I'm conflating ideas process with design thinking, which is for this conversation is close enough. We believe in collaboration from day one. So we're taking clients on the journey as much as our designers or our people are doing that process for them, right? Because a big reason why clients work with us is to have some part of that wear off on them or rub off on them, or the positive version of that, where they're basically learning by doing. And that's how you learn. That's how you figure this stuff out, as you just try it. And you can use design thinking to solve everything. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and she has to write kind of reports on things. And I actually use a design thinking process with her where we start sort of brainstorming, coming up with ideas, using Post-its, and then sort of pick one of those and we flesh it out a little bit and sort of see if it's working. If it's not working, we'll throw it away and start another way. It's the best and the only way I think that you can actually learn it. You can read about it a lot. That's fine. It's not very useful, though, if they're reading it, whether you're not actually trying it. And so with clients, the way that we kind of get them comfortable with it is through doing it. I mean, they are they feel like they're not actually working on the real problem when in fact they are, because we are brainstorming and prototyping everything from when we kick off a project to when we end a project, and we encourage them to take that mindset into even after they ship. Right? A product when it's in market is not done. Right? You're then working on the next iteration, the next iteration, the next iteration. And also, I'm relegating my examples to more product stuff. But again, we use it for everything from the future of Social Security to designing whole companies. So it's not just a product-based approach, although it did start out there, obviously.
And are there specific, other than seeing this work and experimenting, are there other specific habits you think that someone who is, relatively new to the
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that so as we hired IDEO, last year we had 17,000 applicants for 100 positions across the globe, right? So it's a huge funnel with a tiny little bottleneck. One of the ways in which we look for people and how we hire is there's some qualities that we're after. There are 7 of them. I'll talk about 3 or 4 of them. But one of the main ones is to be optimistic. I know that sounds kind of like, oh, you're in California, whatever else. We actually find this in China. We find it everywhere, where it's basically like an optimism around imagining what can be next or what should be as opposed to what is. If you're trying to innovate with a kind of furrowed brow and crossed arms, metaphorically, that's a really bad way. I mean, it'd be so easy to shit all over everything in the creation of something new. But if you're instead leaning into it and kind of nodding, and even if you're hearing bad ideas, to be able to take those ideas and evolve them into something else, we find to be optimistic is a key attribute of being able to do that. Other ones of collaboration, of making others successful, of talking less and doing more. A lot of those qualities are maybe seemingly obvious, but all of those feed into a kind of design thinking mindset, which also wonderfully you would look at corporate America and say, well, there's none of that. But in fact, there's been a pretty profound shift over the past decade, I'd say, to people that are much more open-minded, much more curious, much more hungry, and a lot of that's fueled, I think, by the Bay Area. Just that notion of we can't create what should be as opposed to dealing with what is. Yeah, I'm rambling a little bit, but those are all mindsets that help a design thinking approach.
That's great. That's great. All right. Well, hey, do you mind putting?
Please.
And then, do you guys have any questions for Madison? Because if you come to me after the fact, I can speculate about what Madison might say to a given question, but I won't necessarily be right. Yes, Nicole Cox.
I just had a question kind of about, it seems like in the ideal world you would come to design thinking or starting that process with a completely blank slate. Of like, observing, but I would think kind of that rarely happens. Like usually someone like, how do you prevent that just like inherent bias from affecting, everything from that first like observation,
So let me repeat the question just to make sure I heard it all. So ideally you start with a blank slate approach, you start the approach with a blank slate. Actually, that's never possible. Well, usually it's never possible. There's something that already exists, or you need to understand. In a good way, in a positive way, we actually love not starting with a blank slate. The parameters or the what exists is that can basically help you accelerate what you're learning. So you can study either what a company has done, or you can study what's beeping. Is that me or you? Oh, that's me. You can study kind of what's out there, what a company has done in the past. Use that to kind of frame up. Sorry, something's freaking out on me. To frame up what's there. Sorry, the beeping has got me completely distracted. One of the things that we talk about as we look out into the world is to understand 3 things. One is what's desirable from imagine a Venn diagram of 3 circles. What's desirable from a human standpoint, what's feasible from a technology standpoint, what's viable from a business standpoint. We're looking at the overlap of those 3 circles to learn where to build or where to prototype into. Because you imagine the overlap of 2 of those circles is relatively easy, right? You can understand what people want and you can make it from a technology standpoint, but it has no business model around it. Well, that's not very useful. You can understand there's a piece of technology that you can make, and you can imagine making lots of money off of it, but no one wants it. well, that's no good. That's actually a lot of Silicon Valley, right? They can build something and they can make people want it, but there's no way to make money off of it. I completely did not answer your question because I apologize for that. Feel free to ask it again, and I promise to get it right this time, as I just shut off something. Hold on.
No, it was good. I think we all came in kind of with an idea of something that we wanted to do, and now we're getting to design thinking, and I'm kind of like, oh man, like what if I observe something that like totally like says that's not a good idea, and you need to like start on something else. So kind of like,
Sure. But wouldn't you'd rather learn that earlier than not, right? I mean, but I also don't know that any process of observation is going to tell you if something's a good idea or not. Honestly, we're not observing, and I use observing in a very broad sense. We're not observing for validation. We're observing for inspiration. That's a really important switch, right? You go in with hypothesis, right? You go in to understand and look and listen and prod and to use prototypes to get reactions. Oftentimes we'll prototype what we think are inherently bad ideas early in the process because we want people to react to them. Because you can't ask someone kind of what they need, right? It'd be great if you could, but it's not very useful. Instead, you have to have them, you have to almost trick them into answering that question for you. And you can have them answer that question through exercises, through observing them in the context that they'll be working in, through putting a prototype in their hands and having them kind of respond to it. But I actually don't believe anything is going to tell you if something is a bad idea or a good idea, especially early on in the process.
Other questions for Madison? Kelly Gerhardt.
One question I have is, what is the biggest trap that you see people fall into? So they think they're doing design thinking, but they're actually not.
You're right. Hi. The room keeps going. It keeps going all the way around, doesn't it? So the question was, what's the biggest trap? We're not sort of design thinking police, so we don't believe there should be a kind of like, well, you're not doing it or you're not licensed to do it. It's a very different mentality, right? I mean, if you think you're doing it, you're kind of doing it. I mean, we can always get better at it and master it. In fact, I think as we move into the sort of the second decade of design thinking, it's been really wonderful to watch mastery rise up. In fact, Tim's article in HPR this month is about that notion of mastery as opposed to learning. But there's no kind of dogmatic design thinking religion out there. If you're prototyping, you're getting feedback, you're observing, like you're doing it. I wouldn't worry too much about perfecting or getting it wrong, because that's exactly, I think, kind of the mentality that in corporate America, which leads to, no one can do this, only I can do it. We're not that interested in that stuff. So if you think you're doing it, that's close enough.
Thank you.
Other questions for Madison? Yes.
So makes it look bigger. So this this is more of an execution type question. So I mean, you need to talk to people to understand like your hypotheses or merit or where to go to before. But as far as execution and IDEO, how do you find these people that maybe you don't know that are going to potentially use your product? Like, are you just stopping them on the street? Do you have some services you work with? Like, how do you find these people?
That's a great question. So it depends on what we're working on, right? If we're working on an organizational design program, oftentimes we'll be obviously we'll be looking into whatever the organization is that we're helping redesign. That's one way. Another way is we're out let's say it is creating a new digital or physical service or product. We do actually have recruiting in-house to find people because we for the most part, take a qualitative approach to the inspiration piece and learning. We're not looking for thousands of people. We're looking for tens of people. And so we do have recruiting internally to help uncover those people from around the globe. And oftentimes, when we're looking for those people, we're looking for extreme versions of whatever it is that we're looking at. So if we're trying to solve a problem that is, if we're trying to solve a problem, let's say it's a food project, and you're talking to, you're trying to innovate into a space around, I'm making all of this up, but innovate into the snacking space. we're going to look for the extreme version of someone who does snack or doesn't snack, maybe like a calorie restrictor, or someone who binge eats or whatever else, because we find that if you imagine the bell curve, at either end of that bell curve, you have extremes, but those extremes are more able to talk about something inside of them. They're more amplified versions of a kind of mainstream target. And also some version of their behaviors will be true in 10 years. So like even staying within the food space, 25 years ago, eating organic food was an extreme behavior. You could go to Berkeley and you could find those people, but you'd hear something that if you were to talk to them 25, 30 years ago, you'd say, well, they're really after kind of whole foods, or they're after this notion of, they're afraid of kind of what's in processed food, all of that good stuff. Well, by talking to those extremes, you tap into what would be a major theme for the next 30 years of food consumption. So we're doing that with any category that we're working in, either whether it is more organizational design or it is more product design. Looking for those extremes because they're more turned off, and some version of what they're doing will become more in the middle at some point. And separating out what's interesting about them is kind of what we do. Another thing that we often do is look at analogous industries or analogous examples for things. One of the classic IDEO examples is about 15 years ago, we were working on the redesign of a large hospital chain's emergency rooms. And we sort of looked at the emergency room context and said, how do we get inspired to solve this differently or solve what the real needs are? And we kind of abstracted out what happens in an emergency room. And it's sort of like, high stress, time critical, lots of people doing single functions, yada, yada, yada. I kind of squinted at that and said, that sounds a lot like a NASCAR pit crew, right? It's sort of like hyper-constrained time, people with individual functions, a very singular patient that you're working on, and actually went out and observed NASCAR pit crews to kind of gain inspiration for how we might solve for the emergency room redesign. And actually one very basic takeaway from that was this idea of there's baked-in redundancy in the NASCAR pit crew. So you feel like, for instance, the guy who's holding the gas tank, if he gets hit by the car, there's another guy that's ready to run in and kind of help refill, take on that role, which is great. Except for the guy who got hit by the car. Even something as simple as that and ripping that out of that context and applying it to a new context is a great source of inspiration. So again, looking at analogous industries or analogous solutions to a very similar problem or an abstracted similar problem is a great source of inspiration for us, and one that I would wildly encourage you all to play with.
Cool, thank you.
We got, Madison probably has about 5 more minutes. So other questions? Yes. Sorry, Greg. In the denim shirt. Natalia.
Sorry. Do you have any techniques that you could share that you use when you run into a wall when you're thinking about something, when you just can't see it from another perspective, but yet you know it's not there? Anything that you can share?
Sure. It's a great question and a real problem. I think one of the things that it may be how you all are working as well, but we never work alone. It's always a team. So we have a core team on a program, and then we also have lots of other people like myself who will come in and kind of inspire and or nudge or push. Oftentimes, bringing in fresh eyes into a problem. If we really do get stuck, it is about asking kind of new people and maybe not giving them a full picture, but instead kind of either isolating them on a very narrow thing that you're kind of working on, and or trying that, and or asking a large group of people to help think about things. We find works quite well. Also, going backwards, understanding that you got stuck in a place because maybe you wandered down a dead end by kind of walking backwards a little bit and sort of seeing, or zooming out and seeing if there's a way that you can see it a little bit differently. So I'd say involving more people in the problem, and then also kind of zooming out and or walking backwards are two that we use often. But also the project space and or how we solve things is pretty, it's a pretty fluid environment. Even though we have a kind of quasi-linear process, what you're doing in there, we actually talk about how we build teams is actually very similar to how a small startup will solve a problem, right? There's a 3 to 5 person team with a kind of discrete but also fuzzy problem that they're working on. And so you get blocked quite often, but also there's 74 other things to be working on. And so oftentimes you'll then focus somewhere else. and you almost solve it in the background you'll not solve, but you'll get past that thrombosis by accident in the background. So not overly focusing on whatever it is that's got you stuck seems to help.
Other questions? Scott. Wolford.
Yeah.
Is the camera manually operated, or is it listening to voice?
Yep, it is manually operated.
Okay, all right. Where's Scott? I'm curious. Oh, hey, Scott.
In the back.
No, my question is, what's your favorite book that you've read recently in this topic? And it seems like there's a lot of repetition of, like, I imagine you repeat methodology. I mean, you've been doing it for 20 years, but what are you thinking about next, or where is this headed?
Wow. Favorite book on the topic that I've read recently, to be honest, I haven't read many of them recently. It's wonderful to kind of see what the rest of the world is doing or thinking, but it's also, I'm a firm believer in not a kind of only thinking about one thing or only reading about. If I'm doing this 50 to 60 hours a week, I actually don't know the value of also then reading about it. Instead, I read a lot of science fiction, a lot of kind of other things that kind of force my brain to think about things a little bit differently. One of the ways I love of talking about kind of my basic passion is humanizing technology. Even from when I worked with Alex back at Scout, all the way through my career, is kind of making technology as this beautiful thing much more, bend it to the will of the human as opposed to the opposite. And science fiction does a great job of kind of inspiring me to think about that. So I'll look for that for inspiration as opposed to kind of studying hardcore design thinking bits and pieces. And then the second question was what?
Let's see. What's next? What are you thinking about? What's the what do you guys spend a lot of time thinking about?
Yeah. So actually, over the past 2 years, my biggest client has been IDEO, as we've redesigned San Francisco and how it works. It's about 175 people. It's the biggest IDEO location. So I've been thinking a lot about that for the past couple of years, and it's awesome. I mean, it's so fascinating to be designing both a structure and a process that we're using every day. And by structure and process, I don't mean the design process. I mean how we as a location are functioning and thinking and growing and pushing people and elevating people and all that good stuff. So that's one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently. More organizational design than typical product innovation, which is great. From a business standpoint, one of the interesting, it's not so much a worry because that would be overstating it, but it's fascinating to think that also a lot of our core business is helping large companies create what's next, which is interesting. It's been a paradigm that's been around for a while. One of the interesting shifts in that paradigm could be, is corporate America starting to look at the acquisition of startups to be their innovation pipeline? And that's a sort of not a threat to us, but it may shift how we exist and how we are in market. And so I've been thinking about that a lot as well. Yeah. Hopefully that sort of answers your question.
All right, last question. Kyle, guys.
He's standing, I imagine. Yes.
I'll make it easier, all the way to the back. I had a question. You mentioned organizational design a lot. Many of us here are getting our MBAs, and so we'll be in organizations trying to manage folks.
Sure.
If there were kind of like a couple things you would think about, we can't always just walk in, especially as our first sort of managerial job.
Totally.
Great, we're going to redesign, it's going to be a flat org and everything else like that. I'm sure that would go over very well. But what are some things that you've seen that work in the projects-related organizational design that might be good things for us to think about in that first sort of managerial job?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I actually don't believe that flat organizations are good for everywhere. I mean, we actually often say that we're flat, but that's only relative to the rest of the world. We're not flat. I mean, a flat organization is maybe a one-person company can be flat, but nothing else can really accomplish that. Things to be thinking about. I think one of the scariest common features that we see in corporate America is the siloification of things, where it's like a kind of zero-sum mentality of like, if I succeed or this is mine, therefore it's not yours. And that impedes more progress than anything I think that we've ever encountered. Just because it's I can't tell you how many times in client meetings where we'll get around, we convene a lot of people from corporations, companies, and they work on things that are very similar to each other, and they'll actually be meeting for the first time in that meeting room, right? They'll think they're talking to an IDEO, and they're like, actually, no, we work together. And it's like, holy shit, like, that's amazing that like they wouldn't have known the person sitting just down the hallway as part of their company. So I think that openness to collaboration, that the not thinking that what you own is your value in a company is a huge way to get past that kind of that zero-sum mentality, and one that I think if you embody from the get-go, and you hope others can imbue that because you have, like, it would be a huge, I mean, it wouldn't require too much of a shift. Well, it would, but it's also not a kind of top-down mandate. I think if that the need to have sharp elbows and kind of own things kind of is lessened greatly by someone acting differently. Even if just one person acting differently, I think that can help that situation quite a bit. So that's one thing that I would wildly encourage you to hold on to. We teach that in schools, right? We have a kind of project-based open approach. And then once you shift into a corporate environment, it's much more like, oh, no, here's my stuff. That's your stuff. And that doesn't work so well. But it works fine for kind of a very linear growth path for an individual, but not very much for actually doing good things in a company.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Madison, thanks so much for making the time. It was really great to have you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone. It was very quick. Hopefully I made some sense. I'm not sure.
I think you absolutely did. Thanks for making the time. Big hand for Madison.
Awesome. If anyone has any questions that we didn't get through, Alex has my contact info, so I'm happy to answer any more via email or a phone call or whatever.
Thanks.
Yep. All right.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
See you.